Recording in progress.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are focusing on human trafficking and natural disasters. My name is Christine Commerce, and I am the program director for the Alliance to End Human Trafficking. We are a survivor-informed organization that works to end this atrocity by providing educational resources, giving presentations, raising awareness, and engaging in advocacy across the nation. We also support survivors of human trafficking in healing and thriving through financial support to our member houses and providing educational scholarships. Today, our focus is on human trafficking and natural disasters. The purpose of our webinars is to educate participants on this issue, so they will leave with actionable ways to help identify ways victims are being targeted and also to safeguard our communities and its members. Our webinars are free, but donations are always appreciated. You can donate and find more information about our organization and this issue at the Alliance to End Human Trafficking.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared. It also will be posted on our YouTube channel, where you can find our past webinars on many other topics surrounding human trafficking. And with that, please join me in welcoming our esteemed guests. First, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Carey, who is the founder of Hands of Justice, a consultant. She's an educator, an author, producer, speaker, and overcomer leader. She graduated with a master's in victim studies from Sam Houston State University and taught problem analysis and victim studies for the same department for 2 years. Rebecca is certified in global injustice response training, formerly held the co-chair and survivor position on the board for the Montgomery County Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and served on the Survivor Council for the state of Texas for over 2 years. Rebecca is the author of When Silence Ends, and she now heads the National Survivor Leader Initiative. Next, we have Carrie O'Brien, who has been working with Resilience Force since its founding on legal and policy matters. She has developed and litigated cases on behalf of resilience workers, and she was senior counsel at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Obama administration, and has also been director of services at CASA and a co-founder of the DC Employment Justice Center. She is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and Georgetown Law. And last but not least, we have Mary Kate Entrepont, who is the deputy director of the Louisiana Governor's Office of Human Trafficking Prevention. In this role, Mary Kate implements statewide initiatives to improve the outcomes of victims in Louisiana through prevention, service expansion, and policy change. Mary Kate has provided technical assistance in protocol development, training and awareness, and victim identification to numerous public agencies, both state and federal. Serving in the executive offices under 2 Louisiana governors, Mary Kate is passionate about creating strong systems with lasting impact. Mary Kate is a graduate of Loyola University in New Orleans. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our first presenter speaker, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank the Alliance to End Human Trafficking and Christine for having me out to share today with you all. Again, my name is Rebecca Carey, and as Christine shared, I founded an anti-trafficking organization that works directly with survivors, and I'm also a survivor of domestic sex trafficking myself. Just a little about that. I was trafficked in my 20s by a man that I thought cared about me. However, this man was actually grooming me and would eventually sell me over a 2.5-year period of time. And he did this by exploiting things and situations in my life that had left me in a bad place. I share that with you because although I was not trafficked after a natural disaster, I do believe that there are similarities between victim stories. And it always comes back to one word for me, and that is the word vulnerability. See, human trafficking is a very complex subject because it involves factors way out of the norm of our everyday thinking. It's not black and white like the movies portray. It is very complicated, which often allows it to hide right under our noses. Most people would never think to associate a natural disaster with human trafficking. And the focus of a natural disaster and the aftermath of it is often on anything but human trafficking. And that's kind of where the problem lies. For perspective, I did a little bit of research, and there is research out there that suggests that there was more than 250,000 individuals that are trafficked transnationally just in the Southern Pacific region alone following a natural disaster. After Hurricane Katrina, I think there was 3,750 survivors of human trafficking that were identified in the Gulf Coast region alone. That doesn't include all of those that were unable or unwilling to report it. So numbers do show that there is a huge increase in victimization in the aftermath of a natural disaster. I think they said in 2023 that there were 15 natural disaster events by July of that year alone. And those costs, the losses exceeded about $1 billion. So I hope that kind of gives a perspective of how widespread of an impact natural disasters have on our communities, and why this is so important to talk about it. The national definition of human trafficking that most of us know, I'm going to sum it up. It's the exploitation of an individual for commercial sex or labor by means of force, fraud, or coercion. As a victim, I learned the hard way that human trafficking is often a crime that preys on an individual's vulnerability. And the word vulnerability can mean so many different things. It's individualistic, meaning it can look different for every person. So for instance, it can look like a child being bullied at school to past sexual trauma or homelessness. But vulnerability is very subjective, but it is used heavily by traffickers. Traffickers are experts at seeking out vulnerable needs within vulnerable populations and people. They will groom them to make them believe that they care about them, they gain their trust, and then they will exploit the very thing that made them vulnerable in the first place. And then they'll use it to traffic them. So in knowing that, we now have to think of it in terms of human trafficking after a natural disaster. So let's do that. I want you to imagine that here you have a person in an instance might have lost everything. They've lost their home and all the things in it, their transportation, their safety and security, possibly a loved one. The natural disaster more than likely has affected their jobs as well, which in turn affects their finances and the ability to afford the things that they need. Organizations, law enforcement, and other needed services can be extremely hard to get to, or they can be cut off altogether. There's looting and other safety issues. The list kind of goes on and on after a natural disaster. And unfortunately, a lot of people are left with nothing and sometimes with no help whatsoever. And traffickers know this, and they are going to use it, and they do use it. Things like finding temporary housing, food, safe water, a way to communicate with a loved one, locating a loved one. They're all things that traffickers will use in order to lure a victim. So in a situation like this, a trafficker will come in and promise these individuals help, and they will offer the necessities of food and water and safe housing. They will offer transportation and money. And while they are doing this, they're trying to gain these people's trust and learning as much about them as they can. Essentially, they are grooming them into believing that they care about them and that they are going to help them. In the end, they will be forced, tricked, which is fraud, or blackmailed, which is coercion, so force, fraud, or coercion, into trafficking simply out of the need for survival. I often say that desperation it causes people to do desperate things at times, but add on a real threat to the lives of these individuals, which most traffickers are going to resort to. And unfortunately, you have a perfect situation to prey upon someone with very little people even knowing that it's happening. Everything that I have just shared with you doesn't even touch on all of it. Like, natural disasters will also cause children to become orphans overnight. Populations of people will be displaced. They're going to be unemployed. They might be uninsured. They're left to fend for themselves. And then they're going to seek out opportunities elsewhere, which can always lead to nefarious crimes. There are so many different elements to really look at when it comes to natural disasters and human trafficking. And I do believe that somebody is going to be speaking to the labor trafficking aspect here. But when it comes to sex trafficking after a natural disaster, we must understand and acknowledge that it is happening, and it's happening more and more. We need to recognize that human trafficking doesn't always look like a child being snatched up off the street and sold. In fact, in the United States, that most cases don't even look like that. Most cases look like an everyday normal person who has been preyed upon because of the vulnerabilities that they have. And for some people, unfortunately, the vulnerabilities that they end up being faced with come in the wake of a natural disaster. So I'm really glad that this conversation is being held today, because I don't think this is a subject that's talked about very often. And I hope that I was effectively able to give a picture of how this happens after a national disaster. And I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. And for those who may have received our original flyer, Eileen Dong was supposed to be here speaking on behalf of Hope Pigs Global, but unfortunately she had a conflict. So thankfully, Rebecca was able to step up and fill that role and share her survivor voice with us. So thank you so much for Rebecca. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Carrie.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Carrie O'Brien. I'm with Resilience Force, and thank you to the Alliance to End Trafficking for this invitation to talk about Resilience Force's experience with labor abuse and trafficking after natural disasters. Resilience Force is a national nonprofit organization. We grew out of the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice, which was founded after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We're focused on the resilience workforce, which are those who clean up and rebuild after natural disasters. We are a membership organization and currently have 2,000 plus members, and we were founded by and directed by a labor organizer, Saket Soni. Who are resilience workers? It's a largely immigrant workforce, and including some undocumented workers, largely Latino and heavily Venezuelan. Surprisingly, unlike the rest of the construction industry, there are a lot of women in this industry, 30 to 40%, and it is age diverse, and we have worked with workers from as young as 15 to as old as 65. These workers are mostly already in the United States, mostly based somewhere in the southeastern United States, and they travel to disasters either temporarily for a 6-week to 6 months period, or to permanently relocate themselves and their families to the disaster areas. The New York Times did a profile on these workers and called them hurricane chasers. But they do respond to all kinds of disasters, and they do respond outside of the Southeast. We have had cases in Michigan and are currently working on cases related to the fires in California. But for many, it is a career, and we have members who have responded to more than 10 hurricanes. So here are some of the common themes that we have seen in labor abuse and trafficking after natural disasters. These companies do need a large amount of labor, and quickly. Housing is scarce in a disaster zone, having been wiped out. A lot of the housing stock having been wiped out, and it's expensive. There are many large players at the top of this industry, including large multinational corporations and the United States government. There's pressure from all sides to rebuild quickly: homeowners, voters, renters, companies, etc. There are multiple layers of subcontracting. We've seen as many as 8. There is definitely fraud in recruiting. There are false promises and lots of bait and switch. Recruiting is done largely in WhatsApp groups, is the main method of recruiting large groups of workers all at once. The companies do control the workers' housing and their food. There are lots of threats. We see employers making threats to call the police, to engage in immigration enforcement. And because the companies control the housing, when they make a threat of eviction, which they do, that packs a big punch. because people are far from home and far from their normal support system. There is local police pressure on workers. There's violence. I've been a workers' rights attorney for 25 years, and I never had a gun involved in any of my cases, and I've had 2 in the last 5 years. There are lots of lies about how things work. There is a lack of immigration law services. But to end this slide on a hopeful note, there are some positive common themes that we've experienced. And the first is that workers have a very good knowledge of what is unjust and also what is illegal. Having a worker organization and an ongoing relationship, ongoing programming, ongoing support for resilience workers, and trying to build a movement and a recognition of this workforce, which, by the way, is helping, communities to rebuild and get back in order after a disaster. That worker organization does encourage and reinforce the bravery to come forward and confront these abuses. And then finally, there is a lot of brand sensitivity in this industry. Lots of large companies with brand sensitivity. There are companies that sponsor college bowls. There's a company that's like a major sponsor of the Houston Rodeo. And then also the US government, which in our experience is also a little brand sensitive. So just one example is Signal International. This happened after Hurricane Katrina. Welders from India were recruited with false promises, and they had high recruitment fees. They were repairing oil rigs that had been damaged in Hurricane Katrina. They were housed at a man camp in Mississippi. The man camp included barbed wire guards. It was overcrowded and unsanitary. The workers began organizing with the help of Saket Soni, our founder, and planned, quote, the Great Escape. There was a protest campaign. They marched on foot to Washington, D.C. They engaged in hunger strikes and put pressure on the U.S. Department of Justice. Ultimately, there was a federal civil trafficking trial, a jury trial that was held in 2008, and it resulted in the largest trafficking jury verdict in U.S. history of $14 million. The full story is in this book. It's a really great book. It includes Indian recipes and all kinds of fun things, and it's called The Great Escape: A True Story of Forced Labor and Immigrant Dreams in America, and it's by our founder. More recently, another example, in 2017, Hurricane Irma hit the Florida Keys. Recently arrived Venezuelan workers were recruited from Miami to the Keys. They were rebuilding at 2 luxury hotels. The workers were not being paid, their checks were bouncing, and the employer told them that the entire United States banking system had been knocked out by the hurricane, and that was why the checks were bouncing. When the workers did a march on the office in Miami, the police were called. And there were also threats of immigration enforcement. And that ultimately we sued and got a nice settlement for those workers. The gun cases, one was in Louisiana. The workers marched on the boss after their pay was late. The boss pulled a gun on the workers. The workers did call the police, and he was charged with felony assault. So that let the workers be eligible for U visas. They filed a claim with the National Labor Relations Board, which they won, and the board is currently trying to collect money for them. And the other one was in Florida. So what can be done? Please refer cases to Resilience Force. Please refer resilience workers to us. We are building a movement. Pressure on the actors involved. That pressure in the past has resulted in labor standards being published by Blackstone, which is a private equity Wall Street company that owns ServPro. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is the big player, has also increased its oversight. You can support federal legislation, the Climate Resilience Workforce Act, which we wrote with Representative Pramila Jayapal, which includes a path to legalization for resilience workers. You can advocate for more immigration law services in the Southeast, sign up for our email newsletter, and follow us on all the socials. We also wrote a report in 2020 that includes a number of policy ideas at the federal, state, and local levels, and you can find that on our website. And if you want to keep in touch, here's all my information. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Carrie. We really appreciate it. And with that, we'll go ahead and hand it over to Mary Kate. I'm actually in Orlando, Florida, so we see our fair share of hurricanes. But Mary Kate's in Louisiana, and they get their fair share as well. So she's going to share with us a little bit more about what she does in her community.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Mary Kate Andrepon. I am the director of the Governor's Office of Human Trafficking Prevention here in Louisiana. You've already heard a little bit about Louisiana from both of our speakers. And so with that in mind, my role today is to tell you about a state level response to human trafficking following a natural disaster. So our office is tasked with coordinating and implementing statewide efforts to combat human trafficking. So as you can imagine, I have my hands in everything from prevention, victim intervention, identification, law enforcement activities, prosecution. And so it's been a really effective response to have a state level organization, a governmental organization being able to push through this work and ensure a coordinated response among every part of our state here in Louisiana. So as I noted, you already heard a little bit about Louisiana. We have our fair share of disasters here in the Gulf State. We have hurricanes. We just have your random Tuesday thunderstorm that causes flooding, massive flooding. You have your random Tuesday thunderstorm that leads to a 100-year flood. We've had that here in Louisiana. You have biohazards and environmental disasters. You can probably think of the BP oil spill in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon case. And then, of course, I'm just going ahead and lumping in pandemics and epidemics into that because, as we know, that causes massive disruption and vulnerability as well. So why does disaster response matter? Why does it matter that we have a coordinated approach to responding to human trafficking after disaster? It's because we kind of get the double whammy, right? As you've heard today, and I think it's probably going to be a theme of the day, is disasters cause vulnerability, right? And increase and exasperate vulnerability. So while vulnerability increases, our service response and our capacity to serve existing clients, existing survivors also diminishes. And taken together, it creates a really harmful situation, both for high-risk groups, but also for our existing survivors of trafficking who we're trying to lead into restoration and healing. So here in Louisiana, we think of disaster response according to FEMA's phases of emergency management, right? So thinking about mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. And so if I'm going to pause here just for a second, but I don't have enough time to go deep into this, but I really encourage you to think through how your agency or your community is building in the emergency management phases as you plan and prepare for disasters. So I divided my presentation in 3 buckets. So first, what you can do and what we're doing here in Louisiana within our agencies. And when I say within our agencies, of course, I mean governmental agencies, but also non-governmental agencies. Honestly, even within your home, in your church community, wherever you find yourself, it's really important that we are creating a culture of preparedness, especially in organizations that serve and work with vulnerable groups, whether you directly serve victims of human trafficking or you serve, adjacent groups who on their own have a lot of vulnerability. We have advocated for service disruption planning. We've done quite a few trainings in our state about what does it look like for us as an organization to identify our organizational and client impacts following a disaster and already start planning for solutions to mitigate these impacts. So as we service disruption plan, we're thinking about planning for people. That includes our own staff, but also clients and partner organizations, things, the building, your computers, and also information technology, client records, banking, all of these critical things. And so we recommend building in, like I said, that culture of preparedness, because when a disaster strikes, it's not only your clients that are impacted, but as we all are very trauma-informed, we advocate for trauma-informed care. We are also thinking about our staff, right? And if they're in the community also themselves being impacted by a disaster, we want to ensure that as an agency, we're providing them and accounting for their needs in our own, emergency disaster planning. In our community, here in Louisiana, we have built a human trafficking and natural disaster outreach toolkit, which includes awareness flyers, specifically around human trafficking following a disaster. We built this out a couple years ago, and we've implemented it through our child welfare agency, and we have the Office of Emergency Preparedness and Homeland Security. So I will show you the flyers in a moment, but basically when a disaster comes and shelters are, popping up to serve the need in the community, these flyers go with the people who are putting up the shelters. So our flyers are posted in shelters as, again, an awareness and outreach, education on what to look for. Here's some examples of our flyers. They're available in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. You'll see, and I know you probably I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'll send you the link so you can go and look at it and download them. We tried to use really accessible language, right? So after a natural disaster, not all help is good help. Some offers are too good to be true, because the whole point is, while yes, of course, there are people out there that want to exploit the situation, there's also a lot of help, right? And we want to make sure that people who are vulnerable get access to good help to meet their needs and aren't then exploited by traffickers and others. Finally, within our partner agencies, so for me, when I think about partner agencies, of course, I'm thinking about, FEMA and our Office of Emergency Preparedness, but also our youth serving agencies. We want to ensure that they have the tools they need to effectively identify trafficking or identify trafficking before it happens. So here in Louisiana, we've taken great care to create both a labor trafficking screening tool and a sex trafficking screening tool. When we talk about emergency preparedness around disasters, we really are looking at both sex trafficking victimization and labor trafficking victimization. And so we've created a screening tool for both of these populations that's easy to use, that's accessible, that you don't need prior training for. And so I'm happy to share that out if anyone's interested, but I really think victim identification is a big piece of this puzzle. For us here in Louisiana, we want to build systems, effective systems, right? We want to create consistency around how we respond to human trafficking, whether it's during a natural disaster or when things are great, right? We want to create consistency in our response. So we ensure that kids, victims, adult victims aren't falling through the cracks. And so screening is just a part of this system that we built. It's the first step to identify a possible victim and to ultimately trigger support and services for victims here in Louisiana. So that's my presentation today. I know that was a mad dash. I'm happy to answer any questions. I have a QR code if you want to go to our website. And then on our website, you can go to resources. And then
ride home with Alexis. I'll wait till I'm done.
You can go to resources, and then you can download our natural disaster toolkit and flyers from there. So again, happy to answer any questions, and I thank you all for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate. I really appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and lead us into some Q&A, and I'd like to invite our guests, our audience, to put their questions into Q&A. We won't be doing any live Q&A, so feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as possible. I will lead us off by first asking, which populations would you say are most at risk in disaster affected communities, and why? And where is this happening? Where do we see a lot of this trafficking happening?
I can jump in. I mean, for
Yeah.
us, the populations most at risk are immigrants, immigrants with limited English proficiency, maybe lack of legal status, and perhaps lack of knowledge about how different things work. And then where we have seen it has, a lot in Florida. Sorry, Christine. But definitely in the Keys. And several hurricanes have hit the west coast of Florida. One of those gun cases is from the Fort Myers area. And then the Panhandle of Florida was 2018 Hurricane Michael. But Louisiana has also, had a good number of hurricanes, over the last years that we've been working. But as I mentioned, we also have had cases of labor abuse and trafficking in Michigan, related to some dams that broke in 2020, as well as California, related to the recent fires.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And yes, I can attest to the fact we've seen cases, both sex and labor trafficking here in Central Florida. And sometimes it's happening in other countries, and then they're promising jobs to people here. So we saw a case with Hurricane Dorian, where a family was promised certain work here in Florida. They were brought here, and then someone even set up a GoFundMe account to raise money for the family, and then kept all the money themselves. So unfortunately, there's those scams going on. And that family unfortunately did not receive the pay or the work that was promised.
I can also add,
Yeah.
unless Rebecca, do you want to go?
You go ahead, Mary.
I was going to add too that, again, we've talked a lot about vulnerability. Of course, people who are already vulnerable, disasters exacerbate that vulnerability. I also just want to plug again that disasters may disconnect survivors from services, right? When I worked hands-on with survivors, I think it was Hurricane Ida, I had a client who was really scared to evacuate. I believe it was Ida, don't quote me, but they were under a mandatory evacuation order, and she was afraid to evacuate because she was afraid to leave her fragile support system that she had, right? And I didn't hear from her after the disaster. One of the last texts I got from her was asking, okay, I am ready to evacuate. And at that point, the last bus had already left. And so it really does. Our survivors who we work so intently to help and are trying to support, disasters can create a lot of chaos into their lives. It can, again, create additional vulnerabilities where they already had vulnerabilities. So something to think about how we're also planning with them, safety planning, disaster planning with them far in advance, way before we know that a hurricane is, in the Gulf.
And I'll just piggyback off that. I think that when it comes to a natural disaster, we sometimes forget that these people can be thrown into chaos, into vulnerability in an instant. And that's kind of hard to comprehend when you're what it says to me is that anybody can be a victim of trafficking. Anybody can be preyed upon for their vulnerabilities when it comes to a natural disaster. I mean, there are subgroups, of course, that underprivileged communities that are going to be hit harder just because they're already dealing with a vulnerability, as Mary Kate said, and then they have this on top of it, and the chaos that is ensued that comes after. Most people have no clue how to even handle something like that, let alone know where to turn to find the proper help that's available to them. So it creates way more than people even think about in the long run. So I always just say, look, if you're vulnerable in any way, and I don't know of any one person that doesn't have some kind of vulnerable, then you are open and to being preyed upon by a trafficker, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what would you say some of the lessons that we've learned from past disasters on where traffickers have exploited the chaos?
I can add another maybe solution that we've like a lesson learned. We here in Louisiana have been making efforts to train some regulatory agencies, because we have to think after a disaster, law enforcement is trying to pick up the pieces, right? There may be, more pressing matters to attend to. And so we need to make sure that our regulatory agencies, fire marshals, Coast Guard, um, private security groups. I'm about to train private security examiners here in Louisiana. We need to ensure that our regulatory agencies know what to look for because they're seeing it. They're in these industries. They usually do have some regulatory power. And we need to make sure that we're equipping them with the tools so when they can see exploitation or trafficking, that they can intervene.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say, because unlike some industries, there are very large players at the top of this industry, like the US government and large multinational corporations. And so I do think continued pressure on those entities to do their job with regards to oversight and so on and so forth. With the US Army Corps of Engineers, last summer we brought them 4 separate cases of abuses in 4 hurricanes in 2 states. And we are continuing to try to make the case that this is not, they cannot keep saying this is the subcontractor problem. And by the way, the subcontractor of the subcontractor of the subcontractor times 8. They can't, that's just not an okay answer. And that it's US government money, it's taxpayer money, and they need to take responsibility for what's happening. And they have they have many tools in the federal acquisition regulations that they can conduct oversight. They just don't want to because it takes more time and, gets them in the mess of this, this messy, I don't want to be part of it, but they need to. And they have made some changes and have increased their visits, but they have incredible power to monitor, to disbar, to to visit and to do prior approval of subcontractors. And they're using some of the tools, but not nearly all of them. And the same goes for large corporations. The Blackstone labor standards do make clear that the companies in their portfolio, which includes ServPro, does need to do more with regards to trafficking. But there's very little about the sort of building block labor abuses that lead up to trafficking as well. So there's more that those big companies can do as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think so often we kind of hear that where it's almost like a cop out, like, well, it wasn't our company. We subcontracted someone, right? And we addressed this a little bit in our last webinar on supply chains, right? Even though supply chains can be, there's a lot of different levels with the supply chains. It doesn't excuse a company from not looking into those supply chains and taking the extra time and effort to kind of vet who they're using to provide their products and the resources. Did you have anything you would like to add, Rebecca? Or we can move on to the next question, whatever you prefer.
We can move on.
Okay, great. So I think we kind of addressed this a little bit as far as what the companies can do. What about any humanitarian aid organizations, churches, community leaders, NGOs? How can they play more of a role in preventing trafficking during the recovery phase? So, for example, I know I used to work for Catholic Charities of Central Florida, and one of the things they would actually go out, they would have a kind of a response team that would go out into the areas that the hurricane or whatever natural disaster occurred, as a kind of a response team. So what can we do better with these different organizations, groups responding to these issues?
I think that there needs to be tons of training and education. And I think those 2 things are the first 2 areas that need to be addressed when it comes to prevention. I don't think people understand that this is happening. And if they do, they don't realize that they might be witnessing it because they don't know what to look for. They don't know the signs of what trafficking is. And then even if they do, they don't know what to do if they do recognize it. So I think the first and foremost is we need not only to educate our staffs within our organizations, but we also need to be educating our communities and then engaging in those conversations a little bit more so that we do understand what's happening right under, our noses at times.
And so what do you recommend if someone suspects someone may be a victim of human trafficking, in one of these scenarios? Why do you recommend responding?
Except for me.
It could be for
I
anyone.
would personally, okay. I personally would, I would say before, when it comes to education, you need to recognize that there are organizations probably right where you're at that are dealing with situations like that who can better help equip you if something like this were to happen. So first and foremost, getting educated yourself and then connecting with these organizations so that you have a tangible response if an emergency does arise.
I would also add, if there's any suspected trafficking or exploitation involving kids, make sure you're really dialed into your mandatory reporting laws. You need to report that. That is a form of child abuse.
Great. Carrie, did you want to add anything, or? You're good. Okay, yeah. And sometimes, I mean, I know victims don't typically self-identify, but there are cases that they will. So, I know one call that got one person called into the National Human Trafficking Hotline because she was afraid that she wasn't going to meet her quota because everyone was evacuating for the hurricane. And so for those who may not realize, a lot of times traffickers will set a quota for the victims of that they're trafficking, and if they don't meet that quota, they may not get their food, they may not get their medication, they may be beaten. So that fear factor of not meeting that quota actually can also cause someone to maybe actually self-identify, report. There is always the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which anyone can utilize. And that number I can put in the chat box, or is also 888-3737, 888. So that's another resource out there.
I was gonna also add, and Polaris has done a good job. I love how they talk about identification. They talk about it as proximity, right? You're best positioned to identify potential abuse or victims in the communities where you're proximate, right? Rarely are you gonna, you don't have the context to be driving down the road and be like, oh, that's a trafficking victim, right? We know this, we have this frame of reference, right? So I think it's important that we're also building resiliency for our community, whatever and wherever our community is, around, again, disaster, culture, preparedness, but also around trafficking and exploitation, right? When we train on labor trafficking, we treat labor trafficking as a continuum of exploitation, right? Are we educating people on what exploitation looks like? I think that's why our disaster flyers, and of course I'm biased, are great because it shows what are conversations that should give you pause, right? So if somebody is advertising on Facebook or messaging you on, I don't know, Snapchat and saying, I'll help make, make $1,000 if you go sell, I don't know, selling cell phones, right? In New Orleans, you can drive down and see little signs that say like, we, work with us and you'll make $2,000, right? Are we teaching our children? Are we teaching our youth? Are we teaching our adults that maybe that's a recruitment scheme, right? Maybe that could be an exploitive situation. Are we teaching them about safe online practices? All of these things, I think, wraps itself into, of course, human trafficking. But when vulnerability increases, when desperation happens, we want them to fall back on the education and tools that we've already given them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, I get solicitations all the time, like work from home and, earn way more than I make right now. So, I can see why those are tempting. I usually tell my kids if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. I would always, recommend if anyone is applying to an online job or posting, don't just show up somewhere, like do your research, and especially if you're a minor, don't show up anywhere, by yourself. Because those are definitely tactics that traffickers will use, where you're showing up to an abandoned warehouse by yourself, right? So those are all great points to keep in mind, when we see some of these ads that are posted, and we can see that when people are desperate, that they're willing to take some of those risks more than we may be. So we'll go ahead and we'll transition now to our questions and answers from our audience. Rebecca, there was a question that says, are there agencies that will provide an alternative to those predators after a natural disaster? I'm not sure if does that make sense to you?
Think so. I think maybe they're asking, is there help rather in lieu of being recruited by a trafficking? And the answer is absolutely. Again, why I think it's so important in recognizing that it's happening, but also partnering, or not even partnering, but finding a local organization that can help in situations like this. And majority of them will have something that can aid you in a response after an emergency, rather than if you're recognizing that this is happening to a loved one or recognizing that it's happening to you, you can turn to them instead. So I think having that toolkit that Mary Kate was talking about is so important. Have something like that where you have it tangibly in your hands, of information and places that you can go in when there is an emergency such as this. Yeah. I think there's a lot of organizations that are out there doing something that can help, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So if you're an organization that helps serve the community, having those resources beforehand, as Mary Kate had mentioned, is always helpful. And if you're an individual, it's, even places like Catholic Charities provides some, great resources such as free food and so forth, and other types of assistance that people can take advantage of. I'm sorry, was someone going to say something? I didn't want to cut anyone. Didn't mean to cut anyone off. Okay. So I'm not sure if anyone has an answer, but we'll go ahead and try. With the closure of U.S. aid, has our country facilitated vulnerability among people in poor countries while they cope with local disasters without U.S. aid support? Is anyone familiar with the U.S. aid aspect of? So, okay, so that's okay. Apologies. That's something we can maybe, I can pose to Eileen. If you want to email me directly, I'll be sending out a follow-up survey and the recording. So, with my email address, you can email me directly, and I will try to get an answer for you. I know Eileen Dong, who was going to be on here today, she does work more on the global level, so she may have an answer to that. Next, we have a question. What role has or do faith-based organizations, churches, play in mediation or recognition? Is there an experiential or spiritual best practices that is available? So I think, Mary Kate, maybe you had mentioned that you actually have a lot of resources that maybe a church can even use in their community. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah,
that?
well, so here, I mean, I shared with you the outreach and awareness flyer. I'm hoping I can get you the link to that so y'all can view it. But if not, it's humantrafficking.la.gov/resources/disasters. But for
I can send
churches,
out that link.
yeah,
That's a
thank you.
lot.
I
Yeah.
know.
So you can put it in the Q&A, or I'll be sending out any resources you guys would like to share as well after the webinar.
Absolutely. When I talk to churches and faith-based communities, again, I'm emphasizing to them as you're best situated to serve, your members, right? Your community that you interact with. So I always think about, and I think Rebecca said this, do you know who's serving trafficking survivors? What are the victim service agencies in your community? I think that's really key, that you're connected with them, that you're supporting them. I also think it's helpful, you can host a training at your church, maybe make it a community training so that you're not only lifting up your members, but also your wider community. I think you can also seek out more specialized trafficking training on victim identification for your staff. Or, for example, if you have some type of like pastoral ministry or like, like if you do any like direct services, like food drives, etc., maybe you make sure those workers or staff or volunteers are trained in trafficking identification. So there's a whole host of um, steps you can take, but I really think that training and education is a big one, which seems kind of basic, but sometimes the basic stuff is what, the foundational stuff is what we most need. But then also making sure you're plugged into your network of victim services in your community.
Thank you. I'll say too, so for example, what we've done here in Central Florida for Catholic Charities, they've had a disaster response team, and they will select certain parishes where they will hand out disaster supplies, whether it's water, food, and so forth. So that might be something, if you're in a diocese or in a parish, to consider, is providing those resources maybe for some of those vulnerable people, coordinating an effort like that within your parishes or diocese. And as our presenters have mentioned, really getting the training on what are the signs to look for when it comes to human trafficking. We do presentations, as well as many other organizations. We do them online and virtual or in person if we have someone in your area. But really understanding and recognizing some of the signs to look for human trafficking is also important.
I've done a lot of training in churches. I've gone in and done exactly what you guys said, just helping people recognize what it is that they're looking at or how to recognize it. But I think also when it comes to the churches is where we need to focus on the families that are in it. And I think helping families to possibly come up with their own safety plan in case something like this were to ever happen. And then again, just having those resources that Mary Kate said, to have them available to you beforehand. Again, that's why the safety plan is in place, so that if this happens, you have a plan and you know what to do and you know how to help, instead of just having to deal with so much chaos after that and being left helpless. It's something that churches can very easily help the families that are sitting right there in their building in their own church to do. It's very tangible to be able to do that, and then hopefully it will help family members from having to experience this in the long run.
Yeah, thank you. They can be a very valuable resource. So I'm going to go ahead and ask another question. With climate-related disasters on the rise, how would you say communities should prepare now to reduce those trafficking risks in the future? So we talked about kind of preparing ahead of time, with getting your resources and so forth together, learning who the different community players are. Is there anything else that communities can do to prepare now to reduce trafficking risks?
Yeah, I'll jump in to say that, I think better recognition of these workers who are coming into communities and making these better jobs and making this a more, just making this a better job. I'll tell you about two groups who come in after disasters who are never trafficked, and that's the United States military and the utility workers. They are treated extremely well. The United States government sets up its own camps, Afghanistan, Iraq style, so everybody has safe housing and places to go, and the same for the utility workers. And we can do the same for the workers who are cleaning the muck, who are removing the trees, who are, mucking out drywall, and who are beginning the process of rebuilding, those who are hanging tarps over the roofs. There's no reason those can't be better jobs, with less layers of subcontracting. Zero would be nice. They could just be directly employed by the US government, just like the military, or employed by one company. And those are things that can be, that can be fought for, at any time. Like, why are we doing this extremely important function in this very haphazard, unsafe way?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great consideration. What is the best way that we can make that happen in our communities? Is when you say that they should be having those same protocols, what would it take to have those protocols put in our communities?
Yeah, I mean, the great news about this industry, and the reason, it's one of the reasons why we are so focused on it, is because there is so much US government money, and then a lot of that flows to the state. So there's a lot of control by state, local, county governments, and the US government over where and how this money is spent. And so it's just a matter of, of really, I guess, of political will at the state and county level to say, okay, at least in our county, we are going to do no more than 2 layers of subcontracting. We are going to have this 800 number. We're going to have mandatory badges, and we're going to have the wage rate printed on those badges. And we're going to have this 800 number on the badges. And we're going to fund oversight. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers has a really great oversight model that's not that expensive, where there are monitors that that go and check on whether the labor standards are being followed. And the US government and state governments, of course, have all the power to do that. It's just a matter of putting a little bit of resources to it. I think it's clear, we know that there is so much labor abuse in this industry, and pretty much after a disaster, it is going to happen. And so there just needs to be a little bit of resources, and there's tons of money flowing from the US government, and elsewhere, with regards to that. And just so some of it needs to be earmarked for oversight.
Yeah, that's a great consideration. And unfortunately, I know we've seen, unfortunately, the cuts rather than funding increases to FEMA and so forth. So, which I imagine does have a big impact with mitigation, and affects either before and after natural disasters.
And I can add to that too. And I mean, I work for a government agency, so I'm coming from a government angle. I think if you have any connections to, like, city government, maybe it's I was gonna say parish, because in Louisiana we call them parishes, not counties, any type of like council, county, I don't know. Again, we use parishes, so that's what my brain is stuck on that. Of course, state level, try to think of ways that you can advocate for having a plan and a protocol within your communities, right? So for example, City of Houston does really good work on this. I'd like to say here in Louisiana, we do good work from the role that our office can play in it. But you can also look at City of Houston and some of the work that they've done. So there are governmental agencies, jurisdictions that are really trying to get their hand around trafficking after disasters and having protocols and plans in place. And so that's also one way, if you have those connections, that you can support having a community-wide protocol or response plan.
Yeah, great point. It doesn't always have to come from the federal level. It can sometimes come from state and local levels as well. So we're right at time, but I just want to, if we can just kind of take 30 seconds each and finish off with this. So as we face these increasing climate related disasters, what is one concrete action each of us, whether professionals, community members, policymakers, can take to prevent human trafficking or address human trafficking in these high risk situations?
I'll
go
just
ahead.
be quick.
Go ahead.
I've said it 15 times already today, but have a culture of preparedness. Have a culture that we teach our networks, right? It can be hard sometimes to think about, there's so many gaps in trafficking response and it's such a big issue. What you can do today is have a conversation with your kids, your staff, your church members about preparedness or about human trafficking prevention.
I pretty much was going to say the same thing is number one thing that you can do for yourself and for your kids, for your family is to get educated. Again, you're not going to know what to look for, what to identify, or how to help if you don't know these things. And so getting educated, and then again, creating that safety plan for you and your family so that if something were unfortunately to happen, that maybe you can head off, the trafficking aspect of things. So.
Thank
And
you.
I would say one thing that you can do is get materials on Know Your Rights for disaster workers into the hands of as many people as possible. We have multiple Know Your Rights documents in English and Spanish on our website. I gave a link to Christine. I don't know if that can go to everybody, but those could get out there. I think that can make a difference.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share any resources with our follow-up email to our guests, our attendees. And so with that, we'll like to just wrap up. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for sharing their wisdom and expertise with us today. I wish we had more time. We could go into a lot more details on what are the signs to look for and so forth. But, as they mentioned, have someone come out, really talk about this issue in more in depth and recognizing what do we look for when it comes to human trafficking. So thank you all. Have a great day. Take care and stay safe.